You know that one thing everyone learns in Econ 101? Supply and demand, right? Well, what if I told you it's not the whole story? Not even close. What if the people who literally invented economics had a completely different way of looking at the world? That's what we're digging into today.
All right, let's jump right in. Take a look at this quote from Karl Marx. I mean, he just comes right out and says it. In the real world, supply and demand, they never actually match up. He's basically arguing that economists just pretend they do. It's like a convenient shortcut, right? A way to make their models work without all the chaos of actual markets. And that's a pretty wild thought. Is the foundation of modern economics just built on a useful fiction?
So that just blows the door wide open, doesn't it? If the founding fathers of economics weren't using supply and demand to figure out prices and value, what in the world were they using? What was in their toolbox? To figure that out, we have to do something kind of radical. We've got to, just for a few minutes, forget everything you've ever learned about those neat little supply and demand curves from your textbook. See, for these early economists, the goal wasn't to explain why the price of coffee jumped a few cents overnight. They were hunting for much bigger game. They were after something more permanent, more stable. They were trying to find the underlying natural prices. Think of it like the economy's center of gravity. The daily market prices just kind of woggled around this central point.
Okay, so who are we talking about here? Who were these classical economists? You'd think there'd be a straightforward answer, a simple list of names, but nope. The answer to that question is actually a huge debate all on its own. And get this, the term classical economics, the classical economists themselves never used it. It was actually Karl Marx who came up with the label. For him, it was all about who was analyzing economic surplus, a group that started with William Petty and ended with David Ricardo. But then, fast forward 100 years, and John Maynard Keynes comes along and completely redefines it. For him, it was about anyone who believed in something called Say's Law. So the cast of characters totally changes depending on who's telling the story.
So to cut through all that confusion, most people today define the classical school a different way. It's not about the who, it's about the how. It's about a shared way of thinking, a common method. And that is exactly what we're going to break down right now. This shared approach is often called the long period method, and it's built on three really important assumptions. Three things that these economists just took for granted as their starting point. They treated them as given. And here they are, the three pillars of their whole system: the total output of society, the technology used to produce things, and the real wage for workers. Let's tackle these one by one. Okay, first up, output. And this is a big one because it's completely backwards from how we think about economics today. The classicals just assumed they knew the total amount of stuff a society was making. It wasn't the answer they were looking for. It was the starting point of their calculations. Second, they assumed a given technique. You can think of this as the recipes for making stuff. They just took it as a fact that to make, say, one table, you needed a specific amount of wood and a specific amount of labor. It's not that they thought technology never changed, but they figured it changed slowly. So for their analysis, they just pressed pause on it to figure out those stable, long-term prices. And the last given was the real wage. Now this is absolutely critical. What it means is that a worker's standard of living, the actual stuff they could buy with their paycheck, wasn't set by supply and demand for jobs. Nope. It was determined by culture, by history, by things completely outside of their economic model. It was just another number they started with. So, you've got these three givens locked in place. Now, how did they think about the big picture, the total economy? Well, this brings us to one of the most famous and controversial ideas in the history of economics. You've probably heard of it. It's called Say's Law. The classic one-liner is, supply creates its own demand. And the logic goes like this. When you make something, you're also creating the income to buy it. You're paying wages to workers, you're earning profits for the owners. All that money has to go somewhere. So the idea of a general glut, a situation where the entire economy makes too much stuff that nobody can buy, they thought that was impossible. It just couldn't happen. And David Ricardo, who's a huge name in this school of thought, he summed it up perfectly. He basically said, look, nobody makes something just to stare at it. You make it to use it yourself or you sell it. And why do you sell it? To get money to buy something else. So the very act of you producing something is in itself creating demand for other products. But not everyone bought this idea, not by a long shot. In fact, Say's Law kicked off this huge intellectual brawl between two guys who are actually good friends, and it went down in history as the general glut debate. So in one corner, you've got Team Ricardo defending Say's Law like their lives depended on it. They're saying, A widespread crisis of overproduction is just logically impossible. And in the other corner, you have his buddy, Thomas Malthus. And Malthus is saying, hold on, a general glut is totally possible. His whole argument was about savings. He said, sure, when business owners save money, that's great for future production. But right now, today, that's money that isn't being spent. And that could create a massive, economy-wide shortfall in demand.
And for 100 years, it looked like Ricardo won the fight. His view became the mainstream. But, and this is a great plot twist, a century later, the single most influential economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, looks back at this whole debate. And who does he side with? Malthus. He basically said that Ricardo winning was a total disaster for economics.
So, let's just recap, because some of these ideas are pretty wild. First, the classicals split the idea of value from the idea of output. Prices came from the costs of production, from those givens we talked about. Second, they just assumed that all the factories and machines would be running at full steam. But, and this is the real kicker, they also thought that having a bunch of unemployed people was just a normal part of how the system works. Not a bug, but a feature.
And that leaves us with a really challenging question, one that still matters a lot to today. If the people who wrote the original rulebook for capitalism saw unemployment not as some temporary problem to be fixed, but as a permanent, built-in feature of the whole system, well, how does that change the way we should look at the economy today?